state of emergency in Florida.
The worst outbreak in years of toxic algae.
Green, slimy, smelly, and flat out dangerous invasion.
In the summer of 2014, a giant algae bloom took over Lake Erie.
The algae bloom that turned part of Lake Erie toxic just a few weeks ago is bringing a new level of attention to runoff and several other troubles in the Great Lakes.
Harmful algal blooms. What you heard just now are some of the news clippings that I found on YouTube. In fact, if you do a simple Google search, you'll find more and more lakes suffering from these algal blooms. And it is happening not just in the US, but across the globe. It is one of the consequences when the lake becomes eutrophied. Now you might ask, what is this lake eutrophication? Well, basically, it is aquatic plants, big and small, growing too much and too fast. Yeah, that's probably the simplest definition of eutrophication. Just excessive growth. But why this excessive growth? Well, the answer to this is also simple. Because we are giving them a lot of foods. For these plants, by food I mean nitrogen and phosphorus. And we humans generate a lot of these nutrients every day. And it is not like this whole eutrophication problem is new. We have known about this for quite some time. This is why we banned phosphate detergents. We are trying to improve our wastewater treatment plants. We are checking our agricultural runoffs. We are trying as much as we can to cut down these external loads. But despite our past efforts, many times lakes continue to be eutrophied. So the big question is, why? Why cutting down the external load, the source, does not solve the eutrophication problem? Maybe there is an accomplice that is secretly helping our prime suspects, and we have ignored it so far. Before we talk more about this, let me just quickly introduce myself. Hi, I'm Smitom Borah, and I'm a Global Change Fellow at Southeast Climate Adaptation Science Center. Alright. Let me just break the suspense here. The accomplice is none other than the internal nutrient loading that is coming out of the sediments. To know more about this, I met Dr. Ken Wagner. Dr. Wagner has worked in the field of water resources management for more than 4 decades in various capacities, focusing primarily on lakes and reservoirs. Here's what Dr. Wagner had to say about internal nutrient loading.
Well, nutrients come into a lake or any water body from a variety of sources. And we've long studied the loads from watersheds, from atmospheric deposition. We've even done some work on groundwater, although not as much as perhaps we should. But once they're in the lake, a good portion of the load winds up on the bottom in the sediment. And it's not gone forever. Some of it is, but a lot of it can get recycled back into the lake depending upon biological and chemical conditions. There are a bunch of different ways it can happen, but when it happens, it can actually turn out to be the dominant source of phosphorus and nitrogen for algae in the lake.
But why is this a concern?
Well, the first job obviously is to try to control the input from the watershed, but when it's already gotten in there, shutting off the inflow isn't going to fix the lake. The analogy I like to use is a leaky boat. If you got a boat and it has some leaks in it, your boat fills up with water. You need to patch the leaks. But even after you've patched the leaks, the boat is still full of water. It's not usable till you get the water out. So if you think of the watershed at loads being the leaks, but the internal nutrient loading is the water sitting in the boat, you have to deal with that to make the lake functional again. Well, and it gives you a complete range. You could have very, very tiny leaks. A couple of rivets are loose. So it takes a week for that boat to fill up. Well, if you bail it out in the morning, you can go fishing all day and you're not going to have a problem. On the other hand, if you've got a huge gash in the hull, the water just pours in. Well, bailing it out isn't going to get the job done. So you have to decide where on the continuum the lake sits. Is it the internal loading, the result of long-term inputs, maybe by things that aren't even there in the watershed anymore? or is it something that's still ongoing now in a large way? So if you still have a really serious watershed loading problem, you probably have to deal with that first before you're ready to deal with the water in the boat itself.
Right.
But if you've got just tiny leaks, or you don't even have those leaks anymore, I've worked on lakes that used to have cranberry bogs or duck farms or something else that damaged them, and they're gone now. So that source is gone, but the lake is still a problem because of the internal loading, the ongoing internal recycling, the water in the boat.
So now that we know what is internal nutrient loading, I'm sure you must be thinking, where is the problem? If we know internal nutrient loading can be substantial, why don't we just cut down this load and save our lakes? What are we waiting for? Well, one reason for this is the process of internal nutrient loading is not a simple straight process. There are different ways in which this loading can happen.
Actually, 4 or 5 different ways it can happen. The less critical ones are things like bioturbation by fish and invertebrates. They can stir that muck up. They can process it and put usable nutrients back in the water column, but it's usually not the dominant means. Plants, rooted plants growing, some of them are leaky, and you'll see algae growing around the plants, or in the fall when they tend to die off, then you get a release of nutrients then. But again, unless a huge portion of the lake is dominated by rooted plant growth, it's not going to be the major mode. Then you have the sediment itself. If there's oxygen present, there'll be decomposition. The decomposing organic matter on the bottom will release nutrients. So that's one way it does happen. But if it's well oxygenated, there's probably also natural phosphorus binders present at least. Nitrogen tends to get out, but the phosphorus will combine with things like iron, aluminum, calcium, and drop back into the sediment and not be available for algae. It's when you have low or no oxygen, hypoxia or anoxia, that we get biochemically mediated reactions called redox reactions, reduction oxidation reactions, that will allow the phosphorus to be released from that bottom sediment and move unfettered into the water column up to the point where it encounters oxygen and phosphorus binders, and it'll settle back out. But because that bottom material that's nutrient rich also tends to be highly organic and highly oxygen demanding, you get those conditions that there's no oxygen above that sediment potentially for quite a ways. And now the phosphorus can be released, leak up into the water column, and get far enough up in the water column that there's enough light that it supports algae growth. In a shallow lake, and really as shallow as 5 or 6 feet, you could even have that low oxygen interface right down there where the sediment and the water meet. And even though the phosphorus can't move very far vertically before it encounters oxygen and binders and drops back out, if there's enough light, the algae can grow right there at the sediment water interface, suck up that available phosphorus, and then float up in the water column to form a bloom. This turns out to be a major means by which we get cyanobacteria blooms. We've got quite a few lakes in New England where I do most of my work that have gone anoxic. The bottom has lost its oxygen over 30 or 40 years. A lot of it has to do with development in the watershed. Sometimes it's agriculture. But lakes that were okay when people were doing basic monitoring in the 50s, 60s, 70s, and now 50, 60, 70 years later, we see that the oxygen is gone in the bottom where it used to be present. And now we're getting that phosphorus leaking out. It's interesting, if it's a really deep lake, you might still have an oxygenated zone deeper than the light penetrates. So the phosphorus has to kind of run a gauntlet to get up to where algae can use it, and it may or may not make it. But in places where the entire bottom layer, the hypolimnion, has gone anoxic, that phosphorus makes it up to there, and there are algae, including a lot of the golden algae and a number of the cyanobacteria, that have an ecological niche growing right at that boundary layer between the two water layers, using just enough light from above and just enough phosphorus from the water below.
And added to all these problems is the challenge of quantifying the internal nutrient loading. Here's what Dr. Wagner said.
It is challenging to quantify internal loading, but it can be done, and there's multiple ways to do it. The simplest thing is to measure phosphorus frequently enough at multiple levels in the water column And I say it can be done for nitrogen as well. And there certainly is internal recycling of nitrogen. We just worry more about phosphorus because that tends to determine the quantity of algae produced. Nitrogen in relation to phosphorus tends to determine what kinds of algae are produced. So I talk mostly about phosphorus, but a lot of it does apply to nitrogen as well. If you make those measurements top to bottom, every 2 meters, 3 meters, whatever's appropriate for the depth of the lake, you can actually watch it change over time. If it's a stratified lake, you're looking at the difference over time in the bottom or the difference between the bottom and the top. And that allows you to figure out what mass of phosphorus was actually released. Now, certainly the watershed is still an issue. Internal loading is mostly a summer phenomenon. You can get it under the ice in winter up north, and you can get it any time of year to some degree in the south. But it's largely a summer phenomenon, which is when the flows drop off. So the watershed loading, except for maybe some major storms, another factor in climate change, but except for those major storms, we're not getting the inputs in the summer to the degree we're getting that internal recycling. And as long as you're monitoring the tributaries as well, you can subtract that out and get an idea of the magnitude of loading that occurred over some period of time, typically from late June into, say, September. Now, if you're not measuring it in the water column, you can shortcut that whole thing by taking sediment samples. You can actually measure the quantity of phosphorus attached to iron mostly, sometimes manganese as well, that will get released when the oxygen is low. And by combining that knowledge with knowledge of where and when the oxygen is low, you can get an idea of how much will come out. Just a rough rule of thumb, if you make a measure of the bulk available phosphorus, redox sensitive phosphorus in that sediment, surficial sediment, usually we use the upper 10 centimeters or 4 inches, about 10% of that can be expected to come out in any summer. So if you simply take that mass and divide it into the amount of water, you can see what kind of concentration it'll create. And actually in the deep waters, I frequently see values of over 100 micrograms per liter in the bottom water. It only takes 10 to 20 micrograms per liter to support an algae bloom.
And then there's this problem of climate change.
It's a very real influence. In fact, I mentioned that years and years ago, we see lakes that didn't have this problem. They've lost their oxygen since. Some of that is just ongoing loading to the lake and it hits a tipping point. However, a lot of it's climate change. You think about it, we're talking 50s, 60s, 70s to the present. That's exactly when the climate change has really hit us. We've crossed a threshold. We're seeing the rapid increase. It figures into it strongly. And there's 2 reasons. One is that we're getting more precipitation in some areas of the country, not everywhere, certainly where I live, and there are more intense events, which means we're getting more runoff and more stuff being added to the lake. A lot of that additional nutrient is in particulate form. It's not readily available for algal use. It has to be acted upon in the lake, mostly on the bottom sediment, by decomposition or other chemical reactions before it's available. But if we keep loading it up, yeah, we're going to get more internal loading. The other is temperature, just flat out biochemical reactions. There's an old rule of thumb that if you increase a temperature by 10 centigrade degrees, you'll double the metabolism. I have found that in lakes, it's more like 4 centigrade degrees is all you need. So if I have bacteria metabolizing at the bottom, causing decomposition, creating that oxygen demand, and I cause a 4 centigrade degree increase in temperature, I'm going to double my oxygen demand. That's going to make a big difference in how much of the lake bottom is exposed to low oxygen and for how long. We're getting longer and longer periods of stratification in lakes. We're getting stratification in shallower lakes than we ever saw before. And now we're exposing that bottom to potential low oxygen and that release of phosphorus over a longer period of time. I believe that climate change is a major factor in increased internal load, and that increased internal load is a major factor in algal blooms. And to go one step further to make it worse, because the release internally of nutrients tends to come at a lower ratio of nitrogen to phosphorus, cyanobacteria can utilize, not all of them, but most of them, can utilize dissolved nitrogen gas. They don't need inorganic nitrogen in the form of nitrate or ammonia. They can pull it out of the gaseous phase in the water column. So they mostly need the phosphorus. So we put back nutrients at a low NP ratio. We are favoring the cyanobacteria. And on top of that, the higher temperature favors cyanobacteria because they do better metabolizing their food storage products in higher water temperatures. So higher water temperature favors cyanobacteria because you get a lower ratio of nitrogen to phosphorus. You get a greater rate of growth because they like the warmer temperatures. It's just keyed into their metabolism and the food storage products they use for growth. And then beyond that, if they get abundant enough to raise the pH, that shifts the carbon balance from carbon dioxide to bicarbonate, and bicarbonate is a preferred form for cyanobacteria. So everything about temperature change and climate change pushes us towards cyanobacteria blooms. And it's exactly what we're seeing in the data.
But not everything is all that gloomy. Researchers now know a lot about internal nutrient loading, and over the years they have come up with ways to address this problem. Be it dredging or oxygenating the waters or adding some chemicals, we do have few arrows in our quiver to handle this problem.
There are basically three major ways in which we counteract internal loading. There's other ones that have some applicability, but there's three that are pretty much tried and proven. The first is dredging. Take away the offending sediment. Get that organic, nutrient-rich sediment out of the lake, and you'll have less trouble. Well, much easier said than done. First off, sometimes it's pretty deep and it's physically difficult to get the sediment out. In many cases, the sediment also has a lot of other contaminants in it. So we have difficulty with permitting or disposal of the material once it's out. So dredging doesn't happen all that much. I like to say that if money and permits were no object, I would dredge a lot of lakes. I don't dredge a lot of lakes. The other two options are adding oxygen into the lake. After all, this internal loading, the dominant mode being that release of phosphorus when there's no oxygen at the bottom, that can be countered by putting the oxygen back. Some people liken that to putting your lake on life support, but it does work. And if you do it well enough, long enough, the oxygen demand decreases. You probably never get away from having to do it at all, but you can get to a point where you're doing much less and you're getting a good result for it. So putting the oxygen in, and there's like 7 different ways to do that. You can mix the lake, top to bottom, bottom to top. You can do it by pumping. You can do it by air bubbles. The movement of oxygen out of the air bubbles into the water is pretty slow and pretty inefficient. So if you do that, you have to do a lot of it. Sometimes they do it in chambers so that they don't mix the lake, but it's effective but not efficient. A lot of power costs, a lot of air being moved. The alternative is to actually put real oxygen in, and there's 3 or 4 ways to do that. If it's deep enough, you can literally release tiny bubbles of pure oxygen, and the water will suck that oxygen right out, and it won't cause the lake to mix. Or you could put a chamber down in the bottom of the lake that pulls the water in, oxygenates it under pressure, and puts it back out at a supersaturated level where it expands laterally. Or you could pull the water out of the lake, oxygenate it on shore, and put it back where it came from. And there's pluses and minuses to all of them. Releasing the tiny bubbles is clearly the most efficient way to do it. But if you don't have at least 20 foot of vertical run, you're probably going to cause the lake to mix, and that may not be part of the goal. Okay. So it may not be applicable. You can always pull the water out of the lake, oxygenate it, and put it back. But when you pull it out, sometimes it gets a little warmer. Now it doesn't want to lay on the bottom. There's lots and lots of little tricks. How much oxygen you put in versus how much water you pull out and put back. There's all sorts of technological tricks there. Nothing's easy. But we've done all this. The last means is to actually inactivate the phosphorus. And I mentioned that a lot of this available sediment phosphorus is bound to iron. Iron gives up that phosphorus when there's low oxygen and there's a demand for electron acceptors, and it goes to alternative compounds besides oxygen. So if you could put the oxygen back, you can stop that. But if you can replace the iron with something else that won't give up the phosphorus when the oxygen is low, you can also stop it. That turns out to be the least expensive way to do it. There are multiple compounds that will work. You can use calcium in a high pH system, but it won't work in a low pH system because the calcium will redissolve. You could use iron if you were also using oxygen, but not without the oxygen. The other two that get used the most are aluminum and lanthanum. Lanthanum is a rare earth metal. It's part of a commercially available product called Phoslock. It's less commonly used, but it certainly has applicability. Aluminum, because it's so readily available, it gets used in water and wastewater treatment all the time. So all over the country, there are aluminum production plants that make this stuff, and it's not that expensive. So you can actually buy aluminum sulfate, sodium aluminate, aluminum polychloride, apply it to the lake. It strips phosphorus out of the water column, and then it activates the phosphorus in the superficial bottom sediments. That's what I've done more of than anything else because it works. It's incredibly flexible in terms of application potential, and it's relatively inexpensive. Not cheap, but less expensive than doing oxygenation or dredging.
But we have to be a little careful with its toxicity, right?
Aluminum is toxic in a reactive form, so you have to be careful about what the pH range is when you're applying it and how much you apply at once. In New England, we have not had a toxic reaction from aluminum application in over 20 years. We've learned how to manage it. The amount that's in that reactive toxic form between a pH of 6 and 8 is minimal. It's not enough to kill hardly anything. At the same time, if you have less than 10 milligrams per liter of total aluminum, preferably closer to 5 milligrams per liter for real safety margin, there won't be enough present even if the pH gets slightly outside the range to cause a toxic reaction. So we do both of those. We keep the total dose down. We might have to do it several times to get the complete dose in there, but we keep the dose down and we manage the pH, and it works very well.
So there is hope. There are many researchers that are currently working in different ways to bring this nutrient loading down, and me being one of those researchers, as a part of my PhD program, I'm trying to come up with better models that can assimilate the available knowledge and make better predictions on internet loads in a lake. I hope my models will help lake managers get more informed perspectives while coming up with nutrient management plans in their lakes. And that is it for today. Thank you so much for patiently listening to me. I hope I told you something new and exciting today. And before concluding, I'd like to thank Dr. Wagner for his valuable time. And the music you heard is from YouTube channel called Ill Considered Topic. This podcast is part of Global Change Fellowship Program at Southeast Climate Adaptation Science Center. To know more about us, visit our website secasc.ncsu.edu.